Today we're going to look at the Soviet T-26, or quite early on V-26. So this vehicle was a development of the Vickers 6-ton light tank, so the Mark E types A and B. So the differences between the A and B, the A has the twin turrets, the B has a single turret. So in September 1930, the Soviets bought a lot of different types of light tanks from the Brits. From about September 1930 to January 1931, they bought 15 of these at a price of about £4,200 each. Those 15 went into service in about February of 1931, and then they started production of these about June 1931. So this vehicle in its design was one of the interwar tanks that was taken for its speed, firepower and protection, made up about a quarter of the Soviet tank force in 1941. The Soviets built in a 10-year period from 1931 to 41, just over 10,300 tank variants and about 12,000 support variants. It saw service for about 15 years, so it even went up to 1945 where it's still going fighting against the Japanese. The tracks on this were actually considered to be very good. They said that they could get in excess of about 4,800 kilometres of use out of one set of tracks. So very good when you talk about the mobility of a vehicle. Now the suspension, being British, designed by John Carden and Vivian Lloyd. So we essentially have two axles, we have two bogies, and we have leaf springs, 8 road wheels per bogie on each side. What they found was that the springs were cracking, the road wheel rubbers were perishing quite easily, but they did fix these along the way. Drive sprocket at the front, idle at the back, and that's where we also tension the track, and it's just on a ratchet system, so very easy to maintain. This essentially, in British use early on, started off with a air-cooled Dorman engine, which is about 80 horsepower, but then they went to the Armstrong Siddeley engine, which was air-cooled, and it gave it about 90 horsepower. The Soviets obviously copied those engines. Early engines were also prone to failure, but they did fix these along the way. So quite a mobile tank for its time. So when they first took these to Spain in the Spanish Civil War, they did a few changes. So they generally put a cover over this outlet here, but they also put on the air induction, it looks like a curved metal sheeting that goes over the top of this outlet here, and it just stops a lot of the water from going inside the engine bay. It's like with everything, sloping armour. We can sort of go along in the development of this vehicle anywhere from about 10 millimetres up to about 15 millimetres on the turret. The newer type, the 1933 model, we then see an increase in armour. So now we've gone from essentially a 6.6 tonne vehicle up to a 7.2 tonne vehicle, just with the increase of weight of armour. This being the Type A, we have the 2 turrets. So this has the DT 7.62 machine guns, 1 in each turret, holds about 3,000 rounds. Now early on, if we look at the right-hand turret, they did mount a 37mm French adapted gun, or the PS2, which had a slightly longer barrel, or they did mount a 37mm, I think it's the B3. The right-hand turret remained with the machine gun. It's not until we get into the 1933 model, the Type B, where we go into the 45mm cannon on that one. So crew on this is 3. So you have the driver up the front, 1 in each turret. They have a 240-degree rotation of about a 100-degree gap that they could cover in the middle. Now what separates these turrets from the British turrets is that raised top piece, which includes vision slots. And on the front where the guns are, they did the more cylindrical opening rather than the British where it was more rectangle. So this is when we get into the 1933 model. The Type B, they call it just a fire support vehicle. So this was known as the line tank. This model also introduced the radios. So this was the 71K1 radio, I believe. And on variants that did have the radios, you could see it had a horseshoe antenna around the side of the turret. The only problem with that antenna, it was vulnerable to being damaged by small arms fire. But it had the 45mm gun, and they could carry, I think it's about 122 rounds, depending on the variant, because obviously if we're putting a radio in there, the number of rounds does drop. It was a 2-man turret again, and the driver up the front. Along the way, we even start getting into 1939, 1940s, where this vehicle was continuously being developed, although they did stop producing these in 1941. So these vehicles were produced around Leningrad, so factory number 174. Painted this way because obviously with most armies, if you capture equipment, you use that equipment. 3rd SS Panzer Division were fighting around that area, so they would have captured these vehicles and then reused them. We do have oversized markings because we don't want, when they recognise Soviet equipment, to start shooting at it. So these are the oldest vehicles that we have in the museum. So if you'd like to come and see these vehicles along with everything else, come and visit us at the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum.